World War II was not only fought on beaches, in forests, or across ruined cities. It was fought quietly, methodically, behind desks and inside offices, where paperwork moved faster than armies. Their mass murder was transformed into procedure. Forms were stamped. Lists were compiled. Trains were scheduled with the same precision used for freight. Human lives were reduced to numbers, and death itself was processed as if it were an industrial product. Yet beneath this smooth surface of efficiency lay something far darker. What appeared orderly was in fact annihilation. What appeared lawful was in fact criminal. And the men who made it work did not wear blood on their hands. They wore suits, held ranks, and spoke the language of administration. Long after the gunfire faded and the camps were liberated, a terrible question lingered, one that refused to be buried with the dead. How many of the men who built this system simply walked away? In occupied Paris, one of the most important cogs in this machinery was Kurt Lischka. He was not a frontline soldier, did not storm villages or fire rifles. His authority came from position, not brute force. As head of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Department, his responsibility was chillingly specific. He coordinated arrests, he authorized deportations, he ensured that Jewish men, women, and children were transported eastward to extermination camps, including Auschwitz.
The language used was deliberately sanitized. Resettlement, evacuation, labor deployment. These words filled official documents, disguising reality behind bureaucratic calm. But within the system, no one was confused about the destination or the outcome. Trains left Paris full. They did not return. From France alone, approximately 33,000 Jews were deported through mechanisms overseen by Lischka and his department. Each deportation required coordination, police cooperation, transportation approval, paper trails that stretched across multiple offices. This was not chaos born of war. It was organized, deliberate, and chillingly effective. The Holocaust did not require constant rage. It required compliance, structure, and men willing to make extermination routine. Paris, a city associated with culture and elegance, became a transit hub for death. Families were pulled from apartments, children were separated from parents. Elderly men and women were loaded onto cattle cars. Many believed the lies told to them that they were being relocated, that they would work, that they would survive. The truth lay east, beyond the horizon, at camps designed for killing on a scale the world had never seen. Lischka's office did not see faces. It saw quotas, numbers to be fulfilled. Schedules to be met, efficiency was praised. Delays were criticized. Within the Nazi system, effectiveness in deportation was not only expected, it was rewarded. This is an important truth to confront. The Holocaust was not only driven by ideology, but by careers. Men advanced by doing their jobs well. Promotions followed successful operations. Responsibility was fragmented so that guilt could be denied. Everyone played a role and no one, they later claimed, was fully responsible, and yet responsibility existed. It existed in every signature, every authorization, every train dispatched under armed guard. It existed in the knowledge that deportation meant death, even if the word was never written on paper. By 1944, the scale of the extermination was undeniable. Rumors reached the outside world, survivors escaped and spoke. Allied governments learned fragments of the truth. The Nazi leadership knew exactly what it was doing, and so did the men who implemented its policies on the ground. When the war began to collapse, when Allied armies advanced and Nazi Germany faced defeat, many believed that justice would be swift. That men like Kurt Lischka would be arrested, tried, and punished. That the machinery of death would be dismantled, and those who ran it would be held accountable. For the victims, this belief was not abstract, it was necessary. Justice was the final hope that their suffering had meaning, that the world would not simply move on. As you listen to this story, remember that history survives because people refuse to forget. If you believe stories like this must be told so that silence never wins, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps ensure that more people encounter these truths even when they are uncomfortable. When Nazi Germany surrendered in 1945, the camps were liberated. The photographs shocked the world. Emaciated survivors stared into cameras, living proof of crimes many still struggled to comprehend. The promise was clear: never again. Justice would come. Accountability would follow, but justice, it turned out, was far more fragile than victory. The death factory stopped operating, but its architects did not disappear. Files were hidden, names were lost among millions. Priorities shifted as Europe rebuilt and new political tensions emerged. The urgency of punishment gave way to pragmatism, and the question of how many perpetrators could realistically be prosecuted became politically inconvenient. Some Nazis were tried at Nuremberg. The world watched, sentences were handed down. It created the impression that justice had been done. Yet Nuremberg was only the beginning, not the end. Below the surface, thousands of men who had served the machinery of extermination were slipping back into civilian life. Some were briefly detained, questioned, then released. Others were never arrested at all. The bureaucracy that once enabled genocide now enabled forgetting. Kurt Lischka would be one of them. At the moment when survivors hoped the reckoning had arrived, the system quietly began to protect itself. Legal technicalities emerged. Jurisdictional arguments were raised. Responsibility was blurred across borders and administrations. What had been clear during war became complex in peace. The death factory had been dismantled, but its operators were learning something crucial: the world was eager to move on. And for men like Lischka, that eagerness would become a shield. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, the machinery of extermination ground to a halt, but the men who had operated it did not vanish into history. They stepped out of uniform, shed their titles, and waited to see what the new world would demand of them. For the survivors of the Holocaust, this moment was filled with a fragile hope that justice would finally match the scale of the crime. What followed instead was silence. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied forces faced an overwhelming task. Europe lay in ruins, millions were displaced. Governments were being rebuilt from the ashes. Amid this chaos, attention narrowed to the most visible perpetrators, the architects whose names were already infamous. Thousands of others, men who had made genocide function at the administrative level, were processed quickly, briefly, or not at all. Kurt Lischka was arrested. For a short time, it appeared that accountability might reach him. He was detained by Czech authorities and questioned about his wartime role. The evidence against him was real. His position in occupied Paris was documented. His involvement in deportations was known. The paper trail existed. Then, in 1950, he was released. No dramatic escape, no forged documents, no secret flight to South America. Kurt Lischka simply walked free and returned to Germany under his real name, unhidden and unafraid. He crossed borders legally. He registered his residence. He re-entered civilian life with astonishing ease. In post-war Germany. He rebuilt himself. He married. He raised a family. He became a respected businessman, later working as a finance executive in Cologne's grain shipping industry. His days were filled with meetings, contracts, and professional obligations. His evenings were spent at home, in a country eager to focus on recovery rather than remembrance. The contrast was almost unbearable. A man who had once overseen the deportation of thousands now oversaw commercial transactions. A man whose decisions had sent families to Auschwitz now planned shipments of commodities. The system had not punished him, it had absorbed him. Germany's legal framework became his shield. A loophole in the law prevented the prosecution of crimes committed outside German territory. Even though France had convicted Lischka in absentia for crimes against humanity, Germany refused to extradite him. As long as he remained within German borders, he was untouchable. Justice had become a matter of geography. This legal protection was not unique to Lischka. Across West Germany, former Nazis resumed public and professional lives. Judges who had once ruled under the Third Reich returned to the bench. Officials who had enforced racial laws now enforced democratic ones. The same institutions that had once served dictatorship now defined legality in a new republic. For victims, this continuity was devastating. Survivors of deportation returned to cities where their persecutors walked freely. Families searched for names and trial records and found nothing. The absence of prosecutions was not accidental. It was the result of political calculation, legal convenience, and a widespread desire to avoid reopening wounds that many preferred to pretend had healed. The Cold War accelerated this amnesia. As tensions with the Soviet Union grew, West Germany became a strategic ally. Stability mattered more than reckoning. Experienced administrators were valued, regardless of their past. Questions about moral responsibility were labeled divisive, even dangerous. Public discourse shifted, the language of guilt softened. Responsibility was diffused across the system. Ordinary Germans were encouraged to see themselves as victims of war rather than beneficiaries of persecution. Silence became a social norm, reinforced by law and habit. And Kurt Lischka lived openly within that silence. His address was not hidden. His name appeared in directories. He did not change his identity or flee justice. He did not need to. The system protected him so effectively that he could afford normalcy. Each day that passed without consequence confirmed a grim truth. For many perpetrators, the war had truly ended. For survivors, it never did. The trauma of the Holocaust did not stop in 1945. It echoed through decades of unanswered questions and unpunished crimes. Parents aged without seeing justice. Children grew up knowing the names of men who had destroyed their families, watching them age peacefully. The absence of accountability sent a message louder than any verdict. It told victims that their suffering was inconvenient, that history could be negotiated. That mass murder, if administratively executed and legally obscured, might eventually be forgiven through inaction. France had tried to act. French courts convicted Lischka and others in absentia, declaring their guilt on record. But verdicts without enforcement were symbolic gestures. Without extradition, they changed nothing. Germany's refusal to cooperate transformed international justice into a hollow promise. Years passed, decades. By the 1960s, a younger generation began asking uncomfortable questions. How could a democracy be built on foundations that had never been examined? How could a nation move forward while its past remained legally untouched? Most institutions resisted these questions. They feared destabilization, they feared exposure. They feared the implications of reopening cases that would implicate thousands, including respected professionals, still in power, and so silence endured. Kurt Lischka aged quietly. Each year, without prosecution, strengthened his position. Witnesses died, memories faded. Evidence became harder to pursue, time itself became an accomplice. To many, it seemed inevitable that he would escape justice entirely, another name lost in the fog of post-war reconstruction. But history does not always move according to institutions. Sometimes it is forced forward by individuals who refuse to accept forgetting as an option. And somewhere beyond the reach of German law, a husband and wife were beginning to ask a question that would shatter decades of quiet. What if the system would never act unless someone made it impossible not to? By the late 1960s, the silence surrounding Nazi crimes was no longer absolute. It had cracks, thin at first, but growing wider as a new generation refused to accept inherited amnesia. In universities, in courtrooms, and in the streets, questions surfaced that post-war society had long avoided. Who had committed these crimes? Who had escaped punishment? And why? Into this uneasy moment stepped Serge and Beate Klarsfeld. They were not prosecutors. They held no official power. They commanded no institutions. What they possessed instead was resolve. Serge, a French Jew, had lost members of his family in the Holocaust. Beate, a German, believed that her country could not claim moral renewal without confronting its crimes directly. Together, they represented something deeply threatening to the established order: persistence without permission. Their focus was specific. They were not chasing abstractions or symbols. They were chasing names, addresses, routines, the kind of information that made denial impossible. Kurt Lischka became one of those names. What the Klarsfelds discovered was almost absurd in its simplicity. Finding him required no secrecy, no intelligence network, no hidden files. His address was publicly listed, his daily schedule was predictable. He walked to work, he took public transportation. He lived the life of a respectable citizen in Cologne. The man who had once controlled deportations in occupied Paris now blended effortlessly into post-war normality. This contrast was intolerable to the Klarsfelds. It exposed the depth of institutional failure more clearly than any archive ever could. Justice had not been delayed because perpetrators were hidden. It had been delayed because no one in power wanted to look. They decided to make looking unavoidable. Armed with a camera, they began documenting Lischka's life. The footage they captured was quiet, almost mundane, and precisely because of that, devastating. There he was, walking down ordinary streets, briefcase in hand, no guards, no fear, no secrecy. A former Gestapo chief moving through the city as if history had never happened. When Lischka realized he was being filmed, something remarkable occurred. The man who had once wielded immense authority panicked. He turned away, he tried to shield his face, he ran. It was a reversal of roles that carried enormous symbolic weight. Power had shifted, not through violence, but through exposure. The camera, not the gun, had become the instrument of accountability. The Klarsfelds released the footage to the media. They expected outrage, they expected legal consequences. They expected that once the public saw the face of a man responsible for mass deportation living freely, the system would be forced to act. Nothing happened, the footage circulated. Newspapers reported it. Discussions flared briefly. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. No arrest followed, no charges were filed. Germany's legal position remained unchanged, the loopholes still held. For many, this would have been the end. Proof had been shown, society had shrugged. The conclusion seemed clear, exposure alone was not enough. But the Klarsfelds refused to stop. They understood something crucial. This was no longer only about Kurt Lischka, it was about the credibility of justice itself. If a democracy could tolerate the open presence of genocidal perpetrators, then law had failed in its most basic function. As you listen to this, consider how easily silence becomes complicity. If you believe these stories matter and deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps ensure that truth continues to reach beyond those who would prefer it forgotten. The Klarsfelds escalated their campaign. They wrote, they protested, they confronted officials publicly. Beate Klarsfeld famously disrupted political events, forcing Nazi continuity into the spotlight. Each action was calculated to break through indifference. Their work came at personal cost. They were harassed, arrested, threatened, treated not as activists seeking justice, but as agitators disturbing social order. The irony was brutal. Those who pursued war criminals were labeled disruptive, while those who had committed crimes against humanity lived peacefully. Still, the Klarsfelds persisted. They gathered evidence. They built networks with other survivors and activists. They tracked former Nazis across borders, revealing patterns of escape and protection. Their efforts slowly shifted public consciousness. Even if legal institutions remained resistant, time, however, was not on their side. Witnesses were aging, evidence risked being lost forever. Each year that passed brought Kurt Lischka closer to dying without ever facing a courtroom. The Klarsfelds reached a conclusion as disturbing as it was unavoidable. If Germany would not extradite him, if courts would not act, if publicity alone could not break legal barriers, then justice would never arrive through official channels. At that moment, their pursuit crossed a dangerous threshold. They began to consider actions that lay outside the law, driven not by vengeance, but by desperation. Actions that would force accountability by bypassing institutions entirely. The idea was radical, it was illegal, it carried severe consequences. And yet, when weighed against decades of failure, it felt to them like the only remaining option. The truth had given chase, now it was deciding how far it was willing to go. By the early 1970s, the failure of justice had become impossible to ignore. It was no longer hidden behind legal language or post-war confusion. It was visible, deliberate, and entrenched. Kurt Lischka was aging peacefully in Germany, shielded by laws designed to protect sovereignty, not morality. Each passing year reinforced a devastating reality. If nothing changed, he would die a free man. For Serge and Beate Klarsfeld, this realization marked a turning point. They had exhausted every conventional path. Courts had been petitioned, evidence had been published. Public exposure had been achieved, and still nothing moved. Germany's legal system remained unmoved by moral argument, bound tightly to technicalities that prioritized jurisdiction over justice. At this stage, the question was no longer whether the system had failed. It was whether anyone was willing to act in spite of that failure. The Klarsfelds reached a conclusion that terrified even them. If Germany would not extradite Kurt Lischka, they would remove him themselves. They would kidnap a former Gestapo chief from the streets of Cologne and deliver him directly to French authorities, forcing a reckoning the system had avoided for decades. It was an extraordinary idea, born not of recklessness, but of frustration sharpened by time. They were not criminals by nature. They were parents, professionals, citizens, yet history had placed them in a position where obedience to the law meant accepting injustice. The moral weight of that choice pressed heavily on them. They began to plan. The people they recruited were not extremists or mercenaries. They were ordinary individuals whose lives had been shaped by the Holocaust's aftermath. A photographer whose mother had been murdered in Auschwitz, a doctor, a student. None had experience in abduction, none sought violence. What united them was a shared belief that justice delayed had become justice denied. The plan itself was fraught with risk. Surveillance had to be conducted, Lischka's movements observed. Timing calculated down to minutes. One mistake could result in arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Failure would not only end the attempt, but potentially discredit the entire pursuit of accountability. As preparations unfolded, the moral tension deepened. Could an illegal act serve justice? Could breaking the law expose a greater crime? These were not abstract questions. They were immediate, personal, and heavy with consequence. Meanwhile, Kurt Lischka continued his routine. He walked the same streets, took the same routes, lived within a society that treated him as harmless, even respectable. No court summons interrupted his days, no police knocked at his door. The past remained something other people carried. This normalcy was itself an indictment. World War II had ended decades earlier, yet its unresolved crimes lingered like an open wound. For survivors and their families, the absence of justice was not merely historical failure. It was a daily reminder that suffering could be acknowledged without ever being answered. The Klarsfelds understood that even if their plan succeeded, it would not restore the dead. It would not undo deportations or dismantle the death factory that had consumed so many lives. What it could do, however, was force society to confront what it had chosen to ignore. In the end, the kidnapping attempt did not succeed as planned. The risks proved overwhelming, legal consequences loomed. The operation was aborted before it could be carried out. And yet, the attempt itself changed everything. It shattered complacency. It made headlines. It forced politicians, judges, and the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Private citizens were now willing to risk prison to achieve what the state refused to do. The legitimacy of the legal system came under scrutiny in a way it never had before. Pressure mounted. Germany could no longer dismiss the issue as a relic of the past. International attention intensified. Questions were asked not only about Kurt Lischka, but about how many others like him lived freely within German society. Slowly, painfully, the legal landscape began to shift. In 1979, after years of activism and mounting pressure, Kurt Lischka was finally put on trial in Germany. alongside other former Gestapo officials. The courtroom became a space where history re-entered the present. Survivors testified, documents were examined. The bureaucratic language of extermination was stripped of its euphemisms. Lischka was convicted. The sentence came decades too late for most of his victims. It did not erase the years of freedom he had enjoyed. It did not balance the scale of suffering. But it mattered. It established a precedent. It proved that accountability, however delayed, was still possible when silence was broken. The Klarsfeld's campaign demonstrated something profound. Justice does not always arrive through institutions alone. Sometimes it is dragged into existence by those unwilling to accept forgetting as a form of peace. The Holocaust was not only a crime of the past. Its consequences stretched deep into the post-war world, shaping laws, silences, and moral compromises. The story of Kurt Lischka is not simply about one man. It is about how societies choose to remember and what they are willing to tolerate in the name of stability. World War II ended in 1945, but for those who lived with its unanswered crimes, the war did not truly end until the truth was forced into the open. And even then, the reckoning remained incomplete.